What's up guys, Eric Vasquez here from teachmetodesign.com. Now there's plenty of ways that you can use programs like Illustrator and Photoshop together to create some very cool and interesting artwork. But today's lesson is going to focus on one workflow in particular that we will use to combine 3D shapes along with textures and adjustment layers to make an interesting wallpaper design for your desktop. Okay guys, so today we're going to be taking a look at workflows for using Adobe Illustrator and Photoshop together. So we're going to start off just by creating a new document in Illustrator, and the size of your document isn't super important, but I'm just going to make it about 1280 pixels by 720 pixels and make sure that your color mode is set to RGB. You might not see these options by default, so just make sure that you click this little arrow here next to the Advanced tab and then hit OK. Alright, so the first thing we're going to do is just press M on the keyboard to select our rectangle tool. And then we're going to hold down the Shift key and drag out a square. And we're just going to press Shift and X on the keyboard. And what that's going to do is switch your fill and your stroke colors. So select the stroke and then hit None, this little icon down here that you can see, so that now all we have is a regular black square. Alright, so I'm going to hold down Shift and Option and drag it down so that I can make a copy of the square. And then I'm going to select my first one and come up to the Effect menu and choose 3D, Extrude, and Bevel. Alright, from here you want to check off this little preview option, and we're going to start by changing the extrude depth to about 325. Okay, so now if we hit the Tab key, you will see our square, our 3D square, kind of a preview of it. But we want to change the color. We don't want it to be black now. So what we want to do is come over here to where it says shading color all the way on the bottom, and we're going to choose custom, and then you can make it any color you want. I'm just going to start off maybe with like a shade of blue like that. Okay, and then we're going to hit OK. So from here what we want to do is, at this point we have our first 3D square, but we want to change the color of some of these sides. And if we change the color here, well, it's not really going to work. It's just going to kind of mess things up a little bit. So what we have to do to get around that is expand it. So we're going to come to the Object menu and choose Expand Appearance while we have our 3D square selected. Once you do that, you'll see that you now have guides for all three of these sides. So what you can do is press A on the keyboard to get your direct selection tool, and then we're going to double click our fill color here, or you know what, actually I'm just going to press I to get the eyedropper and sample this color, so that now all three sides are the same color. But now if I double click on the fill color for that one side, I can make it a little bit lighter or a little bit darker. So now you can kind of see how we can start to change up the color of these sides on our own. So we're going to maybe make this a little bit less bright. We don't want to go too bright, maybe something like that. Okay, and now all I'm going to do is maybe kind of rotate it a little bit, and you can move this around however you like. But this is our first 3D square. Okay, so once again I'm going to select my flat black square here, hold down the Alt, Option, and Shift keys, and then drag up to make a copy of it. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to come back to Effect, Apply Extrude and Bevel. Effect, 3D, Extrude and Bevel. Check off Preview. Change the extrude depth to 325. And then we will change the shading color once again. Now, I guess it's not too important what you choose for this, because we're going to be expanding it and then changing it anyway. So come up to Object, Expand Appearance, and just for the sake of mixing things up, we can and probably should use a few different colors. So I'm going to come up to Object, Transform, and Reflect it, just to maybe make it face a different direction. So I'm flipping it vertically, checked off Preview, and we're good. So now we have two squares, one blue, one red, and I'm kind of stacking them up on top of each other. So we're going to kind of repeat this to create a few more squares, and then we're going to play around with kind of stacking them up to get some different interesting patterns and see what we like. So I'm just going to repeat this step a few more times, and I may speed this up a little bit for you guys just so you don't have to watch me create a bunch of these squares individually. But yeah, stay tuned for that, and I am just going to create a few more of these. Alright guys, so at this point now we have 4 different squares in a few different colors here that we can play around with. So this is kind of our first little grouping of squares. So I'm going to select all of those and then hold down Shift and the Alt Option key again and just drag them off to the side so that I can play around with these individually and maybe scale them up and try to create a different configuration with our squares. So you can hold down the Shift key and resize them by dragging from any of the 4 handles inwards or outwards to resize them proportionally. And you can also use the Command Shift and either right bracket to bring a shape to the front or left bracket to send it to the back. So that way you can also change the order of the rectangles or squares rather. And again, also you can always come up to Object, Transform, and Reflect, so that you can also change, reflect them that way. So these are just a few of the different ways that you can change and modify some of the existing squares here that we've created. So already we've got 2 different kind of configurations that we can use here. Okay, and I'm just going to go ahead and create a few more of these, and just try to have fun with it. Try to mix it up and make the shapes look as interesting as you can. And you may decide that you want to move things around, like you don't want to have this kind of aqua colored square in the bottom right on all of them, so try to be mindful of that. You don't want things to be too repetitive. That's going to be important for our next step. But whenever you are happy with the configuration, just click and drag your mouse around all of the squares and press Command or Control if you're on a PC, along with G on the keyboard to group them, or you can select them all and come up to Object, Group, and it'll show you the little shortcut here. So I'm just going to go ahead once again and create a few more of these configurations. Alright guys, so now we basically have 4 different sets of cubes here that we can play around with. So the reason that I had us doing these different configurations is so that we can begin to kind of overlap them and see how things are looking once we start grouping things together a little bit. So that's kind of where the fun part comes in, is once you have these cubes in here, you can start putting them together to create some interesting patterns, right? And this is where we're going to start to think about how things will look once we bring it into Photoshop. So I'm kind of playing around with the positioning of these things in relation to one another. But you'll see here, like, it can look a little bit weird to have all these red cubes in the same space. So you may kind of change it up a little bit and decide that you want to ungroup things and change the positioning of certain elements here, which is totally fine. It's all just about experimenting and trying to get enough variety here in the shapes. But ideally what we want to do is make it so that no 2 colors are exactly next to one another, and we also just want to try and reduce the amount of white or these gaps that you'll get in between the cubes. So this is where you can kind of select individual pieces, rotate them and resize them a little bit more, just to continue building out this pattern. Okay, so just going to play around with this for a few more minutes until I can get some nice a nice chunk of this kind of filled out. Alright, so at this point you guys can see how we are continuing to kind of build this up and how things are starting to pan out and everything like that. So what we can do now is kind of take this whole chunk right here and we can group it once again by pressing either Command Control G or by coming up to the Object menu and choosing Group. So what we're going to do is copy it and then paste it in front by pressing Command C, then Command F, and we're just going to kind of move this on top of our main shape. Sorry, not on top of it. We're actually going to scale it down a bit by holding Shift and dragging inwards from any of the 4 corners. And then we are going to send it to the back by pressing Command Shift in the left bracket or by coming up to Object, Object, Arrange, Send to Back. Okay, and the idea here is to just kind of fill up the remainder of the background. So we're just going to continue making copies of our main group here, and you can rotate the entire group, right? Move things around a little bit and see how things are looking. And then we're just going to do this a few more times until we fill up our entire canvas. And don't worry if you kind of go over the edges a little bit, that's totally fine. The idea and the goal is just to have, have some variety. You don't want things to look too repetitive once again. So that's the whole idea here, is to just, have fun with it, move things around, and see how we're doing. So let's see. I think it's looking pretty cool so far. So I think a little bit more tweaking and we will be good to go. Alright, so again, all I'm doing, just holding the Alt, Option, and Shift keys, dragging one of these groups over to the side, and then scaling it up, scaling it down, until you have something like this. So it looks a little bit chaotic, but we've got our whole canvas now filled with these 3D cubes. So what I'm going to do at this point is press Command A to select all, and then Command G to group these all together into one big group. Okay, so again, Command A to select all, and now we'll press Command C to copy it. And we're going to come over here to Photoshop, create a new document, and we want to make sure that it's the same size. So I think we had 1280 by 720 RGB color space. Okay, so now all we have to do is press Command V to paste, and we want to paste this as a smart object. So go ahead and hit OK. And now we have our whole group here of cubes. Now the problem is that when it brings us into Photoshop, it doesn't want anything to go outside of the boundaries of this box here. So what we're going to have to do is hold down the Shift and the Alt Option key and then drag outwards from any of the four corners. I'm dragging outwards from the bottom right, just so that we can scale this up from the center. Now if I were to just scale this up normally, it would kind of go from in one direction, but I wanted to scale it up from the center, which is why I was holding the Alt and Option key at the same time. Okay, so now we pretty much have our cubes placed into a Photoshop document. So we've brought all of these 3D vector cubes into Photoshop. And you'll see over here we are working with a smart object. So I'm just going to go ahead and call this cubes, double click on the background layer and just delete it. And from here we can start doing some fun stuff in Photoshop. So to start, let's just come down here to the adjustment layer icon and choose curves. And that's just going to add a nice curves adjustment here above our cube layer. So what we can start to do is play around a little bit with the contrast to see what we like here. So we want to get something a little bit more, with a little bit more values. And when I zoom in here, you can see there's tiny little white gaps in there, but we're gonna be fixing that eventually as well. So quick fix for that is I'm just going to add a new layer, let's say, and then sample one of these colors, maybe the dark red color from here. And the way that I'm toggling between my cursor and eyedropper like this is just holding down the Alt Option key while any of my tools are selected, and then clicking, and you'll see, in the preview here, it'll show you which color you're sampling. So I'm actually going to go ahead and sample this dark green color, and now that that is my foreground color over here, I can just press Alt and Delete on the keyboard, and it will fill my entire new layer with that foreground color. Now, one other quick shortcut that's very useful to navigate your layers and move them up and down is if you hold down the Command key and press the left bracket, it will move that layer down one in the layer stack, and if you hold down Command and press the right bracket, it will actually move it up in the layer stack. So we want this to be at the very bottom of our stack, right? And that is going to take care of any of those little white gaps that we saw in between our shapes. Okay, so we now have a background, our cubes, and a curves layer. And with my cubes layer selected, I'm going to come back down to the adjustment layer icon, and this time let's see what a gradient map looks like here. Okay, so the way this works is it's pretty much just allowing us to pick a few colors. If we wanted to change the color of all of these cubes, we can certainly do that, but we'll need to add a few more colors here to make it a little more interesting. And it's just going to kind of use this as an overlay that goes, over our whole pattern. All right, and You still want to have a few dark colors in here as well, just to give it enough contrast like we have in our original artwork. And I'm just kind of experimenting here, so I don't really have any end goal in mind. I'm just kind of taking a look and seeing what this does to our pattern here when I play around with these colors. Okay, and you can maybe move some of these around and see how it affects our design. Play around with that a little bit, and if you decide that you don't like any of these colors, you can always come back in here and change it. So now we have primarily a orange and blue color scheme going on. So it's not looking too bad. I'm kind of digging this so far. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit OK. And now what we can do is see how this looks on top of our curves layer, or do we want to keep it below? And you can also play with the blending mode. So instead of going through and tirelessly clicking each one to see how it looks, the shortcut to scroll through your blending modes is to first select the layer that you want to change, which in this case is the gradient map, and then hold down the Shift key and just press the plus or minus keys on your keyboard. And that's just going to scroll through each blending mode. You can see them changing as I do this in the layers panel. Right, so now we have difference, exclusion, subtract. It's just a really quick and handy way to kind of scroll through these things. And you can also maybe, if you decide that you just want to leave it on normal, that's totally fine too. And you can also use the keys on your keyboard to play around with the opacity. So I think I might kind of go with like a 30% of this overlay here, because it's kind of a nice compromise here. And if you want to change the colors further, you can always come back in your gradient map and just click on this strip up here and change your colors that way. Right? And one other thing we can do is we can add a HueSaturation adjustment layer, which will allow us to change the overall hue and saturation of our total design here, the overall look and feel. So that's looking kind of cool. I want to boost the saturation a little bit, maybe something like that. And so now we have 3 adjustment layers here on top of our cube. So if I turn that off, you'll see what we started with, and then we kind of added our gradient map, our curves, and our hue saturation to get this this color scheme. So I think it's looking pretty cool. I'm just going to try and add a black and white adjustment layer, which I'm going to set to luminosity. And now I can also kind of target specific colors in this pattern. So if I want to enhance everything that's red, I'm just going to use this red slider, right? And same thing goes with the yellows. If I want to brighten up only the yellows in the design, then I just use the yellow slider, which is nice because when you use luminosity, it allows you to have more control over the individual colors in your artwork. Okay, and let's see the magentas. I want to make those pretty saturated. I don't want them to be too washed out like bubblegum or anything like that. I kind of like that intensity there because it adds some nice contrast to our design. So one last thing that I wanted to check out here is let's see what it looks like if we add a texture now on top of our whole design. So I'm going to press D on the keyboard to get my default colors back. And I'm just going to come up here to the filter menu and choose render clouds. Okay, so we'll just quickly add some clouds. Maybe press Command F to repeat it a few times and kind of change up the pattern and the texture that we get. And then we can also use that same shortcut to scroll through our blending modes that we used before. All right, which is Shift and then plus and minus on the keyboard. All right, so linear burn looks kind of cool. I might come back to that. Color dodge, overlay is not bad. And I think I'm going to reduce the opacity of this to maybe about 50% just by pressing 5 on the keyboard. Then I'm going to continue to scroll through these a little bit more. Vivid light isn't bad either. And the goal here is to just kind of show you guys ways that you can use Photoshop and Illustrator together. So this kind of creates a cool collaboration between the two programs that can be pretty fun. And if you want to, you can also, you may decide to invert your clouds. So if you select your cloud layer and then press Command I, you'll actually invert the texture, which doesn't look bad actually. Alright, so it's at 50%. We've got our clouds here. And let's do one more thing. I'm going to select my background layer and then press Command T on the keyboard, and that will initiate a free transform. But we don't want to transform anything. We're actually just going to use these handles as guides so that we can bring some guidelines down into our document. So I'm going to grab a guide up here from the rulers and bring it right in the center. And if you don't see your guide showing up, go ahead and press Command and the semicolon key on the keyboard, or you can come up here to View and go to Rulers, make sure that's checked off, and you should be able to see your guides. Alright, we're going to do the same thing to find the center so that we can find the exact center of our image here. Come to the top of the layer stack, I'm just going to call that Clouds, create a new layer, and now press G on the keyboard to get your gradient tool. Now from here, I'm going to select the radial gradient, you'll see up top, and we want the option that fades from black to transparent or solid to transparent like this. Hit OK, and also we are going to check off this reverse box, and then what we're going to do is click and drag from the center of our image using our guides to any of the four corners, and that's going to create like a nice vignetted effect. So I'm just going to do Command T and then hold down Shift and the Alt Option key and drag outwards just to expand that a bit, like that. And then maybe we will lower the opacity to about 50%, and you can also experiment with the blending modes here as well. Alright, so you can quickly go through and just kind of turn that on and off and see that it just darkens our edges a little bit and kind of leads the eye into the center of the design a little bit more. So we call that vignette. And there you have it. So we kind of made this cool looking 3D cube wallpaper using a combination of 3D shapes in Adobe Illustrator, then bringing it into Photoshop as a smart object where we applied adjustment layers, textures, and a nice vignette to top it all off. So hopefully you guys found this useful. This is just one of many ways that you can use Illustrator and Photoshop together to create some pretty cool and interesting designs. So hope you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching, and if you did like it, please give us a thumbs up, comment, and subscribe to our channel, and go ahead and sign up for the email list, guys. Be the first to know anytime that we put out some new content.